And today we have Professor Nuno giving a presentation with the title Megaprojects and Society. I have been reading Nuno's work for quite some time, so it is a privilege that he is going to give this presentation today and talk about his latest research. A little bit about Nuno before he can start his presentation. So Professor Gill's research has been predominantly informed by studying new infrastructure development projects, so the so-called megaprojects. With his PhD students and collaborators, Nuno has developed theory, conceptual frameworks, and methods for communicating how to design and manage these capital-intensive project-based organizations. His research has investigated development processes, products, and organizational architectures, and contracting and procurement strategies. More recently, Nuno has started to study the role of organizational design in tackling the grand challenges of our century, including population growth, climate change, and the development of the global south. Nuno is the lead editor of Duality by Design, the global race to build Africa's infrastructure. And is currently authoring a book for MIT Press titled The Theory of Projects, Value Creation, and Value Distribution. So welcome, Nuno, to our seminar series, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Elias, very much for the invitation to present some of my recent work to your team, and thanks to UCL more generally, and for the people that are in the audience that have made time to be here today. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through some ideas that capture some of my current thinking, the one that I'm trying to consolidate in this book for MIT, the Megaprojects and Society, a theory of purpose, value creation, and value distribution. And hope so. I plan for 20-25 minutes presentation, but by all means, feel free to interrupt along the way. And then hopefully we'll still have time for some an interesting debate after the presentation. I think I will have more slides than I'll have the time to present, so perhaps I'll have to interrupt at some point the presentation. And if you are interested in the slides, I can share with them later on. So let's start. Let's go for starters. So megaprojects is about these different people define megaprojects in different ways. No, so I see them as these enterprises that are capital intensive to deliver large scale technology. I've seen use of the term megaproject not associated with the development and delivery of technology, but in my research I stick to a more traditional understanding and definition of megaprojects as organizations that we set up as a society in order to deliver capital intensive artifacts. So whether it is infrastructure, like transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, or it can be defense systems or IT infrastructure. No? And when we think about how these, my research is about how these enterprises create value for who, to whom they are accountable, and what do we mean by value, and also related to that, how do we understand their behavior, the way they behave, and how they perform. And if we are going to look and try to understand these issues, we have to, it's worth going back to the 19th century and try to understand some of the initial frameworks that have constrain how our understanding of these big questions and our responses. No, and of course we have to start in the 19th century with the work from Jules Dupuy on cost-benefit analysis. Now that has become a major framework by which we tend to think about these enterprises and we tend to evaluate as to whether they are value for money or not. Interesting cost-benefit analysis. Jules Dupuy was an engineer, no? But he realized, and that I think was quite remarkable. He realized early on that these enterprises were quite political, and also there were significant economic considerations. So he decided to get into political economy because he realized that we cannot talk about massive capital-intensive investments if we do not understand political economy. And that's when he developed a cost-benefit analysis, which in the 50s was then captured by the economics profession, and it is a central element in evaluations of projects and in decisions as to whether governments and companies should or not go ahead. And of course, the other seminal work comes also from an engineer, Henry Gantt, in 1917, and he is the one that developed Gantt charts. And so again today, more than 100 years later, there is not Megaproject which will not where we will not try to capture what's going on, the complexity in some using some form of a Gantt chart. I see some the slides are not full screen mode. Somehow I was trying to do that, but I think now it's okay, right?
Yes, they look fine.
Yeah. So
just that you can see the presenter view, so we can see both the slides you're presenting and the next one.
So Gantt charts. So what's going on? So if we think about these two metrics, it's kind of we have this paradigm where we think about these enterprises as linear, closed systems. Linear enterprises are quite a rationalistic process, no? So that's kind of, and two important methods that we inherit from the beginnings of the disciplines have kind of lead us into this paradigm. Of course, by the 70s, planners were already telling us a very different story. No? So the planners, when they start talking about wicked problems and the way in which these planning was way more complex than, and it was not a linear process. There were many feedback loops that we needed to take into consideration. There were many interests that we needed, that it was the task of managers to coalesce into a single project. And so that would complicate the problem and significantly how to try to reconcile different interests into a single enterprise and a lot of one-off choices. And so that's when the hit point.
Can I interrupt you, Nuno? We can see two slides together, so you're seeing the presenter view. Could you change the view?
So, this one, so like that? Like that?
Yes, that should work.
Yeah. Right. So wicked problems. IT managers also in the 70s were telling us that in their own context, so not physical capital production, but digital systems, large digital systems, again, they were saying, well, assumptions of linearity are wrong. They don't really reflect what we know about the way these enterprises occur. And so, and in particular, this book was the Mythical Man Month, became seminal by saying the waterfall model, which was the prevalent model at the time, is wrong. And so that's when the IT people started to think about agile project management. And in UCL, again, it was Peter Hall, and also another planner. He did research on grant projects, and he came up with this famous book about the great planning disasters, but something and of course part of the disasters were the book is very descriptive again about the politics that complicate so much these enterprises. But something that he also says that people that cite the book less for that, but is equally important, is that disasters are also in capital projects, or that we as a society would benefit a lot if they would happen, but because of a number of difficulties in reconciling competing interests, they don't happen. So it's a disaster is not necessarily just because the initial forecasts turn out to be totally unrealistic, but also it can be a disaster if because of competing interests, important capital investments do not go ahead. Despite all these good work from planners and IT managers, the project management scholars doubled down with the idea that these enterprises were linear and sequentialistic. And certainly after the Second World War, we start seeing a lot of emphasis on PERT, CPM, so the network analysis, and very much this idea that enterprises like those are sequential. And by the 50s, so we are now into the Cold War, with the Iron Triangle had become institutionalized now. So there's this very important paper from Paul Ogadis, the project manager, where he argues that the project is an organization unit dedicated to the attainment of a goal. And then he equates success to completion on time, within budget, in conformance with predetermined performance specifications, which became known as the project's Iron Triangle, and then very quickly moved into the manuals that govern the profession. And so on time, on budget is something that is still around. And this is just, I was checking this annual report on major projects from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and they have this system of green lights. And of course, a red project is something, again, is a successful delivery, appears to be unachievable. There are issues with the budget, with schedule, with quality. No? So again, the idea that success is associated with on time, on budget. And it's not only that, it's also implicit in all this discourse, the idea that stakeholder claims are anti-value, no? Because if the project, if there is a cost overrun, that is going to compromise the benefit to cost ratio. And as a result of that, the project moves from being a high value for money into being just less medium value for money or low value for money. And so there's these implicit in all these paradigm that we inherit is the idea that stakeholder claims are anti-value. So there's I was reading the other day again, the Wizard of Oz, and I saw this quote, and I thought about, well, how fitting this is to talk about the phenomena that we are studying. So this, at some point she asks, is there a place where there's no trouble? Where do you suppose there is such a place, Toto? And then she kind of argues, Dorothy Gale in the Wizard of Oz, there must be, it's far, far away behind the moon, behind the rain. And it's a bit what the industry has been looking for. Now, so we want a place without trouble where these paradigm can be validated. But of course, there's no such place where there's no trouble, no? So, and Rand, Edward Murrow, when he starting to look to the outcomes of mega projects, very quickly realized that on time, on budget was very, very difficult to achieve. And especially if there was some investment in innovation. And it kind of, in the end, it's almost it kind of says, well, make mistakes on a small scale, make money on a large scale, and encouraging managers to not to try to be too innovative in a mega project. And as people started to think about this conundrum, so why are projects not unfolding the way we think they should be unfolding? And of course, these should is normative. So it's like we inherit this legacy of norms from the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. So we started to have a number of explanations. At UCL, Peter Morris came up with one explanation. So we argue, well, we have a competence problem in the industry. So it's kind of, we don't invest sufficiently in front-end strategizing, in the initial planning. So he was arguing that if we put more effort in the early stages, actually, a lot of these problems, problems is a social construction, so on time, on budget, are going away. Someone else came with a different explanation, and that was Fluvberg. And this explanation in Megaprojects and Risk, and the quote there actually is from the blurb on the back of the book, is there are two issues going on here. So it's not so much an issue of competence, as Peter Morris is arguing, but an issue of either dishonesty in the form of what he called strategic misrepresentation. So managers and their pals, in order to increase the chances that these projects can be approved artificially, they manipulate the numbers so the project looks good, and it increases the chances that it's going to be sanctioned. Or even if they are not dishonest, in a worst case scenario, they are fools, in the sense that they can't overcome an optimistic bias. And as a result of that, they tend to be over optimistic when they put together some initial cost forecasts and timescales. By the 20 years ago, Don Lessard and Roger Miller produced a book from MIT that kind of it challenged those two prevailing explanations at the time. So it's kind of, well, and what they are saying is it's not necessarily a capability problem that is going on. It's not necessarily an issue of dishonesty or foolishness. What's going on here is that we have a fundamental tension between effectiveness and efficiency. So a lot of the discipline has been geared towards putting significant emphasis on an efficiency logic, and that of efficiency logic translates in this importance of trying to deliver on time within budget. But what is they notice through a study of a large database of mega projects is that actually there are good reasons as to why that scope evolves. Reasons that are associated to the interdependency between the capital investment and the environment around them, the interest groups that exist in that in the context surrounding the capital investment, key stakeholders, environmental issues, social needs. So they kind of identify that projects unfold in a political environment, and that political environment is going to have a direct influence in the way they perform. And it's not the question that we can resolve all those issues in the early stages, like Peter Morris was arguing, well, do the front-end planning and then all this stuff is going away. So their conceptualization or their explanation for the behavior of these projects is much more longitudinal. So they introduced this notion of shaping, that, well, as the project unfolds, you gradually start tackling these issues. And but the process of coalescing the different interests into one single scope, one single narrative, is a protracted process. And so we can see that you have to sacrifice efficiency for the sake of effectiveness. Effectiveness meaning that we have to deliver, on one hand, a project that is fit for purpose, but that purpose is not the purpose of a single stakeholder, but a purpose of a collective of stakeholders who not necessarily share the same interests. So they kind of bring the politics into into their conceptualization of what a large engineering project is. So it's quite interesting because it's still framed as a large engineering project, but at the same time, you already you see a deeper understanding of the social nature of these enterprises. Still, by this time, this obsession with control, the need that we need to control in order to deliver on time, on budget, has become an obsession. A bit like in Plato's the myth of the cave. No, so people were not being able to see what was going on, and so we became professional bodies in particular became almost paranoid with trying to produce tools and methods that would enable managers to deliver on time within budget without acknowledging the complexity and all the feedback loops that were intrinsic to be able to realize these enterprises. And so we see a lot of calls for more investment on strategic planning, risk management, certainly a lot more calls for investment in procedures and structures to ensure that around governance and assurance, so to make sure that money is not being wasted, and that there are mechanisms to approve change orders, and the mechanisms to scrutinize decisions, checkers on checkers on checkers, and try to measure as much as possible of what is going on in these enterprises. Change control procedures, because people acknowledge, well, there's always changes happening, so we have to make sure if we are going to allow these changes to go ahead, that we need to scrutinize the changes. We need people to produce white papers before changes can go forward and being implemented. We need to have a better understanding of what are the cost of these changes, no? And then tracking. And so you go to any PMO office and you will see a large number of junior graduates just crunching numbers and on whether it's Primavera or Excel or other software application to track progress and monitor. And of course, also in more recently, there was a significant emphasis on trying to create a more cooperative environment between the buyers and the supply chain. Also, these projects are capital intensive. You have to assemble a vast supply chain. People started to acknowledge that we had also a problem with the contracts that were very rigid, that were not aligned with the uncertainty in which that characterizes these enterprises. So we needed more flexible and adaptable commercial frameworks that could encourage cooperation. And we saw a lot of investment in efforts to imbue or embed the relational elements into formal contracts, as well as, and not only to embed relational elements in formal contracts, but also to implement mechanisms to encourage the development of norms of cooperation, mutual trust, and so socialization mechanisms, selection mechanisms to try to get people that fit the culture. In some projects, we could see that there was people using the same email alias for every organization involved in the project, irrespective if they were a supplier, a client. So again, all this try to create a culture associated with projects. And then endow these projects with financial slack. So to acknowledge that it's going to be difficult to anticipate early on how much this is really going to cost because of the process of negotiating the project with the environment. So and given that it's so important from an accountability perspective to try to deliver on time within budget, why don't we endow a third party, endows the project with a significant financial allowance, so they can draw from this contingency in order to finance concessions to stakeholders that without which the project cannot progress. Despite all this stuff that we have, all these major achievements that we have in progress in terms of practices and the increasingly more sophisticated practices that we deploy to try to deliver these enterprises, cost escalation is still the norm. This is just a case of the Olympics. And this is another one from a more recent one from Crossrail, which is a project that, interesting, in 2008, 2009, when it was approved by Parliament, it was already endowed with a significant contingency. You see there here the 5 billion contingency in this idea that we need to create a budget envelope that is robust enough to cope with the need to adapt the scope to the interests of the stakeholders. And still by 2019, they had run out of contingency. And of course, after in the last 2-3 years, we saw that actually the project needed significantly more money. And also actually it also needed more time to be completed. This despite all this investment in governance, in tools, in checkers, and investment in planning. Now, Crossrail was a project that took many years in planning, if not decades. So we can't really argue that planning was there was a negligence during the planning phase, and certainly we cannot argue that there was no contingency, or we cannot argue that the contracts were too rigid, because by then it had become institutionalized the use of very flexible, cost reimbursable contracts to govern the relationships with the suppliers. So I thought about this quote from a French philosopher when I was thinking about where this whole phenomena is today. Now, when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck, right? And because that's a bit where we are, right? We inherit a number of norms and frameworks over the last decades that lead us to frame what has become prevailing behavior as failure. But that is a social construction, right? It's not necessary. This behavior that happens again and again and again, not necessarily is a failure. It is a failure if we frame it in that way. So what I've been trying to do in the book is think, is there a different story, a different narrative, a more positive one that we can produce to understand and to illuminate better what's going on? And I look to this map, and this is a map of the governance of the key stakeholders influencing the Olympics. And you realize governance here is really a struggle. Now you have all these essential stakeholders, essential in the sense that they control resources without which the project is not going to happen, no? And these resources do not necessarily exist on the market, no? So some may control property or land that you need in order to progress, that you need to acquire, but there's not a market in the sense that it is that land that you need. Some may control political influence, some may control critical regulation that needs to be adopted. Some may control planning consent. So all these resources, no market resources, you need to acquire, otherwise the project is not going to happen. And you have to govern these stakeholders, and you don't have the traditional market mechanisms. And these are also sovereign entities. So it's not a question like Williams would argue, well, bring them in-house. No, you can't bring in-house. No? If you are the ODA, or Olympic Development Agency, delivering on behalf of the UK government an Olympic park, you can't bring in-house the British Olympic Association. It doesn't work like that. It's a sovereign actor, and you need to negotiate in a consensus-oriented way a lot of critical decisions that need to be made. On top of this complex governance structure, you also have a problem of you have a situation of extreme uncertainty, because we have because of the long gestation periods of these projects, you can't afford to have all the design resolved before you start making physical decisions and you start physical execution. So you have this massive overlap between construction and design, which is going to gradually reduce the adaptability of your design of the decisions, or if you have to adapt those decisions, the adaptation costs as the project progresses become higher. On top of that, we have this problem, which is the inability to measure social spillovers, right? So we understand that a lot of these enterprises are going to produce value that is not going to be captured by the users of the enterprise, right, of the asset. So you invest into a railway, like a high-speed 2 railway in the UK, and most of us would agree that's not, it can be beneficial for many people that are not going to be users of the railway. It's not, so the value, it's not just about user willingness to pay for the railway. There will be wider economic benefits, some of which these days economists have tools to help us quantify, but then there are many other issues that if people get the policies right, these infrastructures will enable. And also, for example, with the railway connecting the major cities in the UK, people argue that it has a potential to catalyze significant private investment. It has a potential to trigger significant urban regeneration. Of course, it's not automatic. The railway by itself is not, it's not a guarantee that those wider benefits will happen, but it creates the option for them to happen, provided that the policymakers also develop other policies that will harness the potential that the infrastructure has created. But that stuff we don't know how to measure, and when people try to measure, there will be significant disagreement about that. As well as that, then we have the environmental spillovers. Now, regulation may say that there's so much you need to do to mitigate the impact of these capital intensive investments on the environment, on biodiversity, but increasingly society asks managers to commit to do more that goes beyond the law and goes beyond regulation. To protect the landscape as well. And again, we don't know how to measure that. So this puts the projects into a tricky situation, no? Because we don't know how to measure those benefits, but we have to add costs as society asks managers to do more that beyond what the law and the regulation requires. So we make significant investments to mitigate negative spillovers, and those are not captured again in traditional cost benefit analysis. So where does this leave us? It's a bit like a pharmacon, right? These targets, these frameworks, metrics, that we inherit, they are both a cure and poison, because we need them, right? There's a practical problem. So you are a treasurer, you are a CFO like in Intel. Now you have to plan, you have to estimate reserves. You need to know when is this going to be completed, what do you expect from my cash flow, when can I expect the project to be, how much is this capital do I need to mobilize to enable this project? So there's this practical problem. So this practical problem is not going away, and indeed we need commitments early on. So these commitments are important, and if as the project fails to meet these commitments, we are going to have these perceptions that the project is failing. So this is not, it's very difficult to pretend that this construction can be replaced by something else, because this is a practical construction. And if anything, there are many people that also have vested interests in perpetuating this construction. Now you see reports from McKinsey, consultants trying to promise to help clients deliver on time, on budget. McKinsey actually got very recently in trouble again in France, because apparently it's a consultant that has had a prevailing role in helping the government. But their reports are very much around when it comes to capital project investment, very much jumping on the traditional bandwagon. We will help you deliver on time, on budget. Even artificial intelligence, machine learning, all this, a lot of the startups are jumping into the same bandwagon and saying, well, hire us, guys, and we'll look to your data, traditional data. We are not going to assemble new data sets, and we will develop some mathematical algorithms that will help us to eliminate some necessary or increase the predictability, project predictability, the predictability to deliver on time within budget. At the same time, because despite all this stuff, what we see is that increasingly a difficulty, and this is the data on this slide comes from ISP2, an increasing difficulty to deliver on time, on budget. It's the pharmacon, right? It's poisoning relationships between society and these enterprises. Now, when you look to ISP2 and like the graph there, and you think these guys started saying it was 12 or 15 billion. Now they say it's something, and this is in 2011 prices, right? Now they say it's something between 50 and 70, which is good. At least now they are acknowledging there's uncertainty. But independent forecasts say, well, guys, this is will be at least 90 billion or more. So society says, what's going on here? How can it? How is this possible in the modern age that we start an enterprise a bit more 10 years ago, and the price is going up in this way? And this is, and the cost benefit ratio, the benefit to cost ratio is declining dramatically. You know, why are we doing this? So the society, so we lose the trust. So this is a massive problem that somehow we need to move forward. Now, existing ideas, it's not about replacing existing ideas, because they are not going away. And to some extent, I think they are all right. So there might be a bit of optimism bias. There might be a bit of strategic representation. There might be a bit of capability problem, but that they are all together, those existing ideas are producing a narrative that is really toxic and unhelpful, more so in a context where we need significant capital investment. So this led me to think more about what's going on when we look to this graph. What is going on here, no? And it's these non-market stakeholders, this disconnect between the planning and the execution that has become unhelpful. No, we need to create new conceptualizations of these projects where we overcome these missing, we replace this missing link with a more comprehensive understanding or model of how these enterprises can be realized. When you think about the non-market stakeholders, people can say, oh, just consult and you'll be fine. But is consultation really enough? Of course, and if it was enough, we wouldn't have problems. Now, because if you look to how, certainly in the UK, these projects unfold, you spend millions doing consultation. It's statutory anyway, so you will not be able to progress without consulting all these stakeholders in the environment. So consultation is helpful to understand what are the concerns, the interests, but with some stakeholders, it's not going to be enough. No, for some stakeholders, it stands to reason that you need to bring them into the project. It's not going to be enough to ask them what would you want and then thank you, but I'm now going to meet with my managers and we'll agree what's going to happen. Now, some stakeholders have resources that are so essential to enable your project to progress that you need to bring them in. You need to share with them decision rights, and this is the board meeting for the Olympics, and you can see who is present there, and the number of factors that are having veto power over the critical decisions that have to be made in order to build an Olympic park. And you'll see British Olympic Association, you'll see LOCOG, which is a watchdog of the IOC, you see the Department for Culture, Media and Sports. So you realize that these guys enfranchised actors, and it was not just about listening to their concerns, but they really brought them in and they share decision rights. They transform decision-making into a consensus-oriented process by creating this sort of, I guess sociologists would call it a boundary organization right at the core of your project. Of course, this creates interesting issues from a research perspective, questions that we need to ask about who should be in, who should be out, that we still lack rules to answer those questions. That's an area where I believe there's a lot more, we need a lot more research. Our own studies of mega projects have identified that invariably some key stakeholders are going to be in. So the structures normally in through local working groups, you tend to bring key stakeholders into and share decision rights with those stakeholders and form these working groups. So that's kind of where I argue that the governance of these projects is quite polycentric, which is something that has been missed in the traditional management literature that looks into these enterprises. But of course, once you do that, now you have created problems of collective action. We know collective action is a struggle now, because we have to find ways to bridge differences between actors which have different agendas, different interests, but somehow are at the same time unified by the higher order goal. Otherwise, they would not agree to join these groups of collective action. So we are going to have right at the heart of these enterprises significant problems of collective action. If you see the collective action problem there, now you start to realize it's not surprising that they behave the way they behave, because collective action is a struggle. It is advantageous in the sense that it encourages norms of cooperation. It can encourage stakeholders to volunteer essential resources to your projects. But those stakeholders will also want to renegotiate the distribution of value. They will ask, what's in it for me? And they want to maximize the share of the value that is going, their own share of the value that is going to be created. So those are the stakeholder claims. So that you end up starting with one initial scope, and you have to do way more beyond what you thought you were going to do. It can't be just about maximizing your economic goals. And so this narrative I capture into, and I have to be careful with time now, and I probably will stop here, into this model, which is a kind of will be central to my argument, and I call it a purposeful form of organizing capital production, where I argue that the purpose, we need to widen our understanding of why we do what we do. Why are we doing this capital intensive investment? Of course, there are specific economic goals that are captured and measured through projections of the electricity bills, water bills, revenue from use of the railway or the highway tolls. So there are those specific economic goals, but then there's something else going on in that purpose, which I call duty-based goals, so wider environmental and social responsibilities. And both are part of the purpose of these enterprises, and they are both legitimate concerns, no? So once you set up one particular purpose, then you have to build your coalition. You have to reach out these non-market stakeholders that control important resources to enable your project to progress. So as well as your suppliers, right? And once you have this bundle of resources that is sufficient to progress, of course, you set up a target, which your intended project behavior. And then it starts the renegotiation of the distribution of value. Now, as both with stakeholders, non-market stakeholders that you share decision rights with, as well as with others that you manage through bilateral relationships. No, so they will all, in order to cooperate with you, they will ask for more than you offer them. So you have to renegotiate the value distribution. So you have to and that in terms of how much is going to be economic returns, how much is going to be social and environmental spillovers. No, that renegotiation of the value distribution is going to adjust the purpose of your mega project, but it also has a very practical implication, because you have to renegotiate often contracts with your supply chain that in the meantime was already on board, and you have to adapt the targets and the organizational boundaries of your own project. So, and this leads to this gap that is perceived as a project failure between intended and realized project behavior. This perception of failure is very difficult to overcome because of the practical needs. But I suppose if we supplement that construction, that social construction, with a social construction that more explicitly acknowledge the role of these enterprises as instruments of distribution of value, perhaps we can attenuate at least the deficit of trust that the traditional construction creates between mega projects and society. And that may enable us also to start to create structures early on that are more collaborative, where we can enfranchise more stakeholders and have and start with a more realistic definitions of purpose that are more aligned with what society actually wants from this, or is willing to accept from these enterprises, and perhaps gradually we can reduce this gap between intended and realized project behavior. And I'm going to stop here, so we have at least some time for questions.
Thank you, Nuno. Great presentation. We already have questions in the Q&A function, so I'm just going to read the first one. So the first question is by Ian. Is linearity the significant feature of this difficulty? I see it more as a continuing to follow a plan blindly whilst ignoring changes in the external environment. The actual dilemma is, should we change now, or should we complete our plan, then change it after? And Ian, if you want to provide some more context, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, perhaps I can address that. Yeah, I think the frameworks that we have implicitly assume the process is linear, no? And it's often the case. And I had a recent presentation from Intel in my class, and their processes are incredibly complex with massive overlap between design and construction and the continuous resolution of user requirements as the project unfolds. And still there was this traditional representation where you do the planning, you do concept design, you do construction, and then you installation, commissioning, no? So, and and you see that so often everywhere in so many publications where you see what are extremely complex enterprises that have so many feedback loops represented as a linear process. Of course, this is an assumption that we make to manage what is a really complex phenomena. But that assumption is a practical assumption that we make, which has the advantage of making things a bit more simple than they are. But of course, it's also going to hurt us later on when we fail to deliver the expectations that we have created. It's a trade-off, right?
Yes, it looks like I am unmuted now, Nuno, so hi. Thank you. I've often said that the only place that projects look like nice sequential blocks is when you create a PowerPoint afterwards. I've never seen a real project that doesn't have iterations, trial and error, parallel tests, particularly in the early stages. And in my experience, that carries on later and later. But on major capital projects, I'm often buttonholed as, oh, you're waterfall. No, I don't really recognize waterfall as anything anybody was ever taught. So it's that linear nature that sort of gels. I think most projects will go through a sequence. You can't ride on a railway until you've built one. And I think it's a misnomer to think just in terms of linearity.
Yeah, I agree with you. We need to,
but
it's not as 70 years. We are building on assumptions that are quite are deeply seated in the profession, in the project management profession. No, so it's not. In order to dislodge these assumptions and replace them with conceptualizations that capture or reflect better the reality of these enterprises, we need to create new narratives, new arguments, new ideas, new constructions. No, so that's what I'm trying to do is to, and I think it's unfortunately. If you read the book of Lessard and Miller, in 20 years ago, actually, there was one paragraph where they mentioned value, the projects as instruments of value distribution. The whole book then went on to project shaping and this debate on efficiency versus effectiveness. But for almost 20 years, there has been this, we allow this disconnect between value and the project performance in the traditional sense to widen, and I think we need to bring it together.
Yeah, I can fully agree with that. Although having worked in the process industry, I don't think the gap was as large as it is in other parts of major construction or the public sector, that moved into this sort of totally separating, identifying what we need to do from then delivering it, and almost compartmentalizing them, and therefore things were delivered that might have been a good idea 5 years previously.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree. Context matters, no? And if it is a privately financed enterprise, if we are thinking about, and well, I'm bringing the example of Intel, which is one that I know well. So it's a different game, right? If it's a capital-intensive enterprise financed by the taxpayers, to a degree, we are all principals, right? It's the government is an agent of our interest of our money. So we kind of feel entitled to make claims on this project. And so we see public projects as instruments as having an obligation to tackle the grand challenges of the problems of society. So it's about, well, what is your project doing for biodiversity, for climate change, for job creation, for inequality, and it becomes more difficult. It becomes difficult for the project to say, well, it's not my job to solve the problems in the environment around me, because it's the taxpayer that is paying for that. If you think about a privately financed project, and you see, for example, the discussions between Intel and Brussels and Germany, as Intel is planning to set up shop in Europe with this, and each fab costs several billions. What Intel is saying is, I'm happy to move into Europe, but I'm not a charity. I'm not going to pay for all these other for the costs of fixing all these other problems around my project. So if you want my project to be also an instrument of value creation that goes beyond the law, then you need to give me grants.
Yeah. So
you have now, the state needs to be the agent and purchase the cost of meeting the claims of the stakeholders, and then that protects the budget from the company to be more focused on economic value creation within the law. So it's a fundamentally different game.
Sunila, you have raised your hand. Do you have anything to add? You'd like to say?
I don't think actually I raised my hand. I might have done it accidentally, but I'm very much more interested in, in your diagram, the end, how you talked about economic and social spillovers. And then you just gave me
environmental and social.
Yeah, sorry, environmental and social spillovers. And then you gave us an example of Intel not really wanting to get involved in that aspect, but they just want to do the project. I think this is the biggest mindset change in terms of what a project really is. Is it to just deliver a piece of rail or something else that's a physical asset, or is it also a responsibility and a commitment to everything else that's going on around us in our world?
Yeah, so it's this discussion about the purpose, right? So of course Intel is going to do a lot for the environment, and is going to do a lot for social it will try to create social value, in as much as they feel it also helps to further the interests of the company. But at some point you need to draw a line, right? This is about, it's this whole discussion of ESG. So how far do you go? Also, because how far can you invest money from your stakeholders, your shareholders, in order to create wider value for society? So it's like shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism, and this is a very complicated debate, and we see, and ESG perhaps can bring some objectivity into this debate by helping us measure some of what is the benefits that it brings to shareholders, if those shareholders allow the managers to invest into distributing value. I suppose it's quite different when it comes to a public sector project, because then you don't have this boundary between the interests of the shareholders and the rest of society. But that said, because of new public management, a lot of these ideas of traditional conceptualizations of projects as instruments of value creation end up shaping how we also frame the purpose of these enterprises, And definitely, before this talk, I was checking the Green Book. That was the new version in the UK that was released just last week, to try to understand how they measure value for money. And it is quite disappointing, because in the end, if you download it, you'll see the definition of value for money. So they made progress in terms of, it's no longer about this benefit to cost ratio, which was associated with, well, if it was the traditional BCR, it was just traditional cost benefit assessment or an adjusted BCR. So they argue that it's a balanced judgment that needs to take into account other factors, social and environmental. So value goes beyond economic value creation. That's good. But then they kind of neutralize that statement by saying that value for money is about delivering smart objectives. And then when they define smart, the M is measurable. So at the same time, they say the project needs to create environmental and social value, and they acknowledge those, we don't know how to monetize or evaluate in money terms those environmental and social spillovers. So they say that, and then they say that the project needs to deliver smart objectives, and the M is measurable. So you can see this tension in Treasury saying, how far are we going to allow are we going to widen the purpose of these capital investments? No, and so, but some people will look into this problem from a moral and ethics perspective. That's not what I do. I try to look it from a legal and economic and managerial perspective, because I suppose if you look at, that's also where the management scholarship is going, right? Because if we argue that we need to widen the purpose because that's the right thing to do, that gets into morals and ethics, and we get stuck because it's very difficult to make progress there. So perhaps if we say that if we widen the purpose up front, that will help us perhaps create a more predictable environment. That might be interesting, but we need now to produce the evidence that perhaps projects that start with a wider purpose, in the end, can create more predictable environments. I'm trying to do I'm going to have a PhD student next year, and that's kind of where we are going. But we need to get the data to check if that is the case or not.
Okay, thank you, Nuno. It's definitely an interesting conundrum, and maybe this is something that we'll be working on for a few years.
And Richard Denufil raised his hand. Hi, Richard. You are muted.
Thank you, Nuno, for your time. I don't really have anything to add to your interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you, Richard. We still have to meet face to face, but it will happen.
This is as close as we've gotten, and I look
yeah, that's true. We are making progress.
Right. So we have a question from Robert Bierwolf in the Q&A. So why do we keep ourselves hung up to such paradigms as the golden triangle, aka success? And are we not adaptive in our thinking, perceptions, and consequently action? Is the gap maybe not really a gap, but is the gap our joint responsibility to collaboratively learn how to manage the gap over time?
These things take time to change, right? It's about we have to be patient. No, the project's Iron Triangle got institutionalized, is deeply institutionalized in society, and there are many actors that have vested interests in preserving the status quo. No, I keep telling McKinsey, I think, for example, I think, guys, you could have very lucrative jobs in the same assignments, and you don't need to be an advocate of on time, on budget. You could still be a very successful consultant if you, at the same time, you'd drop this obsession with the on time, on budget, and you try to encourage and steer your clients to see these projects as instruments of value distribution. But I've not been successful, that's fine. I always, whenever I see a McKinsey report, for example, I get very disappointed. No, Treasure, I think, is making, in the UK, certainly is making more progress. Academia, I think, is also making progress. But again, when you look to the press, the mainstream press, it makes a lot, it's very sensationalistic, right? To say, hey, the project is is badly run. People were quite dishonest at the beginning. They are incompetent. They are fools. That kind of makes headlines. It sells. It can't. And in a society that is so unequal, it kind of lashes to people's anxieties and frustration. So okay, let's find some scapegoats, and it's about it's not easy to eliminate these old paradigms. So what we have to do is produce new ones that at least can attenuate. And then there's always, and I have some friends, Ian Reeves, for example, he reminds me, it's a practical problem as well. Now, if you are a treasurer, if you are a CFO of a company, oil and gas company or mining company, you need to estimate reserves. So you want to have some predictability, and then you expect your managers to stay within that scenario that you were promised at front. So I suppose what we have now, we have a game, and we don't. The rules of the game are quite imperfect, and they get even more imperfect by the fact that we don't know how to measure a lot of these social and environmental spillovers, right? So we are playing a game with imperfect rules, and it takes time to change the rules of the game. And because the people then try to survive within these, they have to play by the rules of the game, and you may end up, okay, if society is not going to appreciate front the value that this project is going to create in terms of for society, for social benefits that we can potentially create, if the society is not going to appreciate, not society appreciates, but some of the people that measure, they are not going to appreciate some of the costs that are going to be incurred that go beyond law in order to do more for biodiversity, for the landscape, for climate change, then perhaps I'm not going to include those costs initially. Because if I do that, if I'm fully transparent and acknowledge all the costs that I expect have to be incurred to negotiate this project with society, and if society does not let me show the concomitant benefits that I expect the project to create, then the project is not going to happen. So I have to leave out in the early stages some concessions that I know are going to be inevitable. And then we'll find out later who's going to pay for that and where the money is coming from. So until we change the rules of the game, I don't think we are going to change major differences in behavior. And also, and because there are so many vested interests in perpetuating the existing rules of the game, we are not also going to change major. It will be changes in perceptions of performance are also going to be slow. But I think we are today in a better position than we were 10 years ago. So that's good news.
Thank you, Nuno. I realize that we are 10 minutes past the hour. So, and we have so many questions. That means that the presentation was really engaging and got people thinking. But I will try to stop now if it's okay with everyone. Yeah. Because of other commitments, of course. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Nuno for sharing his thoughts, and the presentation was just amazing. It is the first time that I see so many questions being put forward to a presenter. So thank you all for coming to this session. Stay put for more interesting sessions with our seminar series. I would like to again thank Nuno for giving us the honor to present his latest research, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nuno.
Bye.
Bye-bye.